In this three-part video, you will learn about how to find bills and how to trace them as they pass through the Ontario Legislative Assembly. In the first part, we will look at what bills are and how we identify them. In the second part, we'll look at how bills are passed, and finally, in the third part, we'll learn how to follow a bill using the Ontario Legislative Assembly website. Now let's look at how bills are passed. It is important to know the basics before we actually look at following a bill through the General Legislative Assembly. Do not worry, however, everything you see here will be explained in greater detail in Part 3, and by the end of that part, you'll know how to find a bill. To become a law, a bill must be considered and approved 3 times by the Legislative Assembly, and certain things happen in between, usually at set stages of the bill's progress. The bill must be considered 3 times. They're known as readings. At the first reading, there is normally no debate. It is, in general, a formality. It is deemed read without debate, though there may be a vote on it. At the second consideration, the debate proper begins, and usually the motion is to favorably consider or read the bill a second time and then refer it to a committee. At this point, if it passes, the bill is then considered by a committee which may or may not hold public hearings, receive testimony, and so on, with a view towards recommending any changes to the legislation. At the conclusion of their work, they report back to the parent body, in this case the Legislative Assembly, which then considers the committee report and the recommendations. They can agree to the report and to all the recommendations contained therein. They can consider the recommendations on a point-by-point basis. They can reject the committee's report, or they can send it back. In the first 2 cases, once the report is dealt with, they immediately go to a third reading, and if the bill passes that third reading, it becomes law. A bill is given a first reading, and there is normally no debate. It is introduced and deemed read all at once. Sometimes the individual introducing it will rise to talk briefly about the bill and its purpose. The bill is then passed, assigned a bill number, printed, and put on the orders and notice paper, where it waits to be brought up for its second reading. Here is an example. The bill was introduced. There was no debate, and in this case, the vote to read it, consider it read the first time. Some MPs objected during the voting process, and so a recorded vote was taken. The bill, however, passed, and so the first reading version was prepared and put up onto the Legislative Assembly website. At some point, and this is all driven by rules specific to the type of bill, whether it's a government, private members' bills, or a private bill, the bill is brought up for a second reading. At this point, we get a full debate. It can go on for several days, and then if passed, the bill is normally sent to a committee for consideration. And at this point, we actually leave the Legislative Assembly, we leave the documentation created by the Legislative Assembly and generated by it, and we look at committee documentation. Let's look at the second reading here to the bill that we're examining. Note the date, November 21st. There's usually a great deal of debate at the second reading, especially if the bill is a contentious one. In this case, the second reading took place over the course of a week. And finally, on November 28th, the second reading vote was taken. At this meeting, it passed and it was sent to a committee for consideration, specifically the Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs, and so we now go look at committee material. Now there are in essence 3 types of committees. Standing committees, which are set up under the standing orders of the Legislative Assembly and have primary oversight and legislative consideration responsibilities in their areas. In other words, they look at matters that come up that are in their assigned areas of competence. Currently there are 6. A Standing Committee on Justice, Policy, Social Policy, General Government, a Standing Committee on the Estimates, a Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs, and a Committee on Government Agencies. The bill may also be sent to a Select Committee, which is an ad hoc body struck as needed. Normally a bill goes to a Standing Committee, but a Select Committee may be struck and the bill sent there if the subject matter warrants it. Finally, the entire legislature can sit as a committee of the whole and consider the bill. This is done when a government wants to move very quickly, and this is how emergency legislation, for instance, is passed in one day, and is also used when the government doesn't want the public to have any input. At the committee stage, the committee meets under a different set of rules of procedure, and also creates its own separate discrete set of documents. And it is very important for us to remember that we are no longer in the Legislative Assembly here, but rather in one of its committees. In terms of research, this is extremely important. Now, the committee examines the bill clause by clause. They may receive testimony Other MPPs, members of government, internal, and they may receive testimony, or they may solicit and receive external testimony. The purpose of the committee's work here is really to examine the bill clause by clause and then report back with any recommended changes. Committee deliberations are also important for many reasons, one of which is that if you're looking for civil society input in a bill, if you're researching policy, civil society input usually happens here. In this particular case, with the bill we're examining, the committee met 3 times. They decided to recommend changes, and it was also decided, as you can see here, that the recommendations were sufficient to warrant a reprinting of a bill. So we have a second version of the bill. Here's one page from one of their meetings. And notice here that we have a list of members of the public who spoke on the bill. Now, the Legislative Assembly, once the report is received, they look at the bill now in 2 stages that normally follow each other immediately: the report stage and then the third reading stage. In the former, they're only looking at the changes recommended by the committee, not the bill itself. And the changes, of course, can also be suggested. And as mentioned, they can decide to accept all of the recommendations in the report. They can decide to accept some but reject others, or they can reject them all. Once they've addressed the report, and the normal state of affairs here is the report is accepted in its entirety, but this is not always the case, they then move immediately to the third reading. Now, the third reading starts off with a motion to deem it read. This is the last chance for the opposition to stop the bill, and so the debate here could be long and quite acrimonious. At some point, a vote is taken, and if the motion passes, the bill, having been considered or read 3 times, is now deemed to have passed in the Legislative Assembly. It is law, however, in order to have effect, it must still receive royal assent and must also commence or coming into force. And so to summarize, bills are read or considered 3 times. Normally, a bill is sent to a committee for consideration after the second reading. The committee's job is to look at the bill in detail and to receive outside testimony if needed. Once a bill is read 3 times and passed, it becomes law upon receiving royal assent. Following royal assent, commencement or coming into force follows. And that ends the second part